You call it border security, Mr. Homan, but history will call it what it truly is: state-sanctioned cruelty wrapped in the ugly rhetoric of white nationalism. The sharp, theatrical voice of Representative Jasmine Crockett sliced through the humid air of the Rayburn House Office building, echoing off the mahogany-paneled walls and straight into the lenses of 4 dozen live television cameras. Bang, bang, bang. The wooden gavel crashed down on the dais, but Crockett paid no heed. Next to her, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar sat upright, her posture rigid, nodding in practiced synchronization. The red recording lights of CNN, MSNBC, and C-SPAN glowed like predatory eyes in the gallery. For 20 straight minutes, the 2 progressive lawmakers had orchestrated a devastating rhetorical offensive. They threw every moral indictment in the modern political lexicon across the committee table: human rights atrocities, xenophobic militarization, and unconstitutional roundups aimed at terrorizing vulnerable migrants seeking sanctuary. Sitting barely 10 feet away, on the other side of the witness table, Tom Homan did not flinch. He didn't twitch a muscle, he didn't interrupt, he simply sat with his broad shoulders squared, thick hands folded calmly over a plain manila folder, his eyes cold and immovable as granite, while Crockett punctuated every sentence with dramatic hand gestures, playing directly to the viral clip machine of social media. Homan merely watched the digital clock count down. He was a veteran investigator who understood a fundamental rule of political warfare: never interrupt an opponent when they are digging their own grave on national television. And so, Mr. Homan, Crockett concluded, leaning forward and glaring over the rims of her glasses, her voice dripping with calculated disdain, we demand to know how you can sleep at night knowing your policies represent the darkest moral failure in modern American history. I yield back. A heavy silence settled over the hearing room. The gallery held its collective breath. Several junior aides behind the Democratic dais traded triumphant smiles, convinced the ambush had succeeded in framing the hearing as an open and shut trial on racial justice. Slowly, deliberately, Tom Homan reached out. His fingers adjusted the metal gooseneck of his microphone. He didn't look at the cameras. He didn't look at Crockett. Instead, he reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a massive 400-page black binder stamped with the official seal of the Federal Office of Inspector General, and let it fall onto the oak desk. Tud. The dull, heavy sound reverberated through the microphones, cutting through the murmurs in the gallery like a gunshot. "Thank you, Congresswoman," Homan began. His voice was low, gravelly, and utterly devoid of theatrical emotion, a chilling, clinical contrast to the screaming that had preceded him. "You've given the American public a very moving performance about moral failure. But with all due respect, I didn't come here today to debate abstract philosophical feelings. I came here with receipts." Homan turned his gaze slowly from Crockett and locked his eyes directly onto Ilhan Omar. "Congresswoman Omar," Homan said, his tone dropping an octave, razor sharp, "you talk constantly about human empathy, about the sacred duty of the American taxpayer to absorb, feed, and shelter the entire world without question. So let's talk about feeding people. Let's talk about Minnesota. Let's talk about the $250 million stolen under your watch in the Feeding Our Future scandal." The temperature in the room instantly plummeted. Omar's posture stiffened. "For the record," Homan continued, flipping the binder open with methodical precision, "that program was funded by the hard-working taxpayers of this country. It was explicitly designed to feed impoverished, hungry American children during the height of the pandemic. $250 million, the largest federal relief fraud scheme in the history of the United States." Homan tapped his finger on the open page and gestured toward the chief clerk. "Clerk, please project Exhibit 1A onto the monitors." The giant digital screens flanking the committee room flickered to life. Instantly, the screens displayed high-resolution intelligence slides, bank transfer routes, corporate shell filings, and side-by-side color photographs. On one side were architectural blueprints of multi-million-dollar luxury coastal villas in Istanbul and seaside resorts in Turkey, alongside registration documents for imported Porsche sports cars and custom Range Rovers. On the other side was a photo that caused an audible gasp to ripple through the press gallery. 14 primary defendants, Homan stated, his voice ringing with cold authority as laser pointers tracked across the screen. 14 key ringleaders indicted by the Department of Justice for siphoning federal meal funds away from hungry children to buy overseas real estate and fleet vehicles. And right here on Exhibit 1B, you will see 6 of those indicted individuals sitting at a private, high-dollar fundraiser dinner in Minneapolis, seated at the head table, raising glasses, smiling shoulder to shoulder with you, Congresswoman Omar. The camera shutters began clicking frantically, a rapid, deafening rattle that echoed across the high ceilings of the Rayburn building. Omar's hand jerked slightly. She reached for her gold-trimmed pen and began clicking it repeatedly. Click, 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 the rhythmic, nervous tapping betraying the composure she had displayed only moments earlier. Now, the Department of Justice called it an audacious criminal conspiracy. Homan pressed on, refusing to grant even a second of breathing room. I call it something much simpler: the weaponization of human compassion for raw financial plundering. But that was only the tip of the iceberg, wasn't it? Homan turned another heavy page, the crisp paper scraping against the wood. Let's look at your domestic ledger, Congresswoman. Let's look at the Federal Election Commission filings for the Ilhan for Congress Campaign Committee. Homan leaned into the microphone, enunciating every syllable. Between 2018 and the height of your congressional tenure, official campaign records show that over $2.8 million in campaign contributions were funded, directly into a single private entity, E Street Group, LLC. And who owns E Street Group, Congresswoman? Your husband, Mr. Tim Minette. The room was so quiet that the faint hum of the air conditioning became audible. Look at the symmetry of this scheme, Homan said, his voice tightening with devastating logic. On national television, you preach to struggling middle-class families in Ohio and Texas. In Pennsylvania, people who can barely afford their own groceries, telling them they are morally obligated to surrender their public resources, their schools, and their tax dollars to fund an endless pipeline of foreign beneficiaries. But when we follow the actual cash, when we trace the paper trail through the shell corporations and the consulting invoices, we discover that the moral crusade ends right where your family's private bank account begins. Omar's face had completely drained of color. The defiant sneer was gone, replaced by a tight, strained grimace. She leaned violently to her left, her shoulder pressing against her chief legal counsel as she whispered in rapid, agitated bursts. Her lawyer frantically flipped through a stack of congressional procedure manuals, trying to find an emergency lifeline. Point of order, Mr. Chairman. Omar suddenly barked into her live microphone, her voice strained, cracking slightly under the pressure. This witness is engaging in baseless character assassination. Under House Rule 11 and the Speech and Debate Clause, I am not subject to personal interrogations regarding outside civil matters. The witness is completely out of order. Tom Homan didn't back down an inch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply leaned closer to the desk, his eyes boring straight through the nervous Congresswoman. You can hide behind your committee rules, Congresswoman, and you can hide behind your legal staff, Homan countered, the finality in his tone landing like an iron hammer. House rules may protect you from answering my questions today, but they cannot erase the federal wire transfers, they cannot delete the bank records, and they will not protect you from the American taxpayers who finally see the truth behind the curtain. Before the chairman could even bring the gavel down on Omar's objection, Jasmine Crockett's open palm struck the dais with enough force to rattle the committee water glasses. Let's call this exactly what it is, Mr. Chairman. Crockett's voice boomed over the microphones, her eyes blazing as she cut straight across the procedural chaos. This isn't an oversight hearing. This is a staged political tribunal designed to drag 2 prominent black and brown women in Congress through the mud because the other side doesn't have the courage to debate our policies on their merits. She turned her body, aiming her words directly at the center row cameras. Mr. Homan sits there reading cherry-picked numbers, trying to paint every progressive movement in this country as corrupt, Crockett said, her tone sharp, rhythmic, and brimming with defiance. Well, let's talk about my campaign, Jasmine, for U.S. Every single dime fueling my office comes from grassroots America. It comes from $5 donations from grocery clerks, $10 contributions from public school teachers, and $15 from working class folks in Dallas and across Texas who actually believe in justice. We don't take corporate slush funds. We are powered by the people. So if you think you can sit at that witness table and manufacture a scandal out of clean, small-dollar democracy, Mr. Homan, I challenge you, show us the crime. Show the American people one single dirty dime in my ledger. The Democratic side of the gallery murmured in approval. Crockett leaned back, folding her arms across her chest, chin raised, daring him to respond. Tom Homan didn't raise his voice. He didn't take the bait. He reached calmly to the left side of his desk, picked up a single blue procedural folder, and looked up at the committee chairman. Mr. Chairman, Homan said, his voice flat and steady, pursuant to the committee's subpoena issued 72 hours ago, the department wishes to call its scheduled fact witness to the table. The heavy oak doors at the back of the hearing room creaked open. The murmurs died instantly. Heads turned toward the center aisle. Walking slowly between the rows of reporters was an elderly woman wearing a modest beige cardigan, leaning heavily on a four-pronged metal cane. Her steps were cautious and deliberate. Beside her, a congressional bailiff guided her gently toward the secondary witness chair. For the record, Homan stated into his microphone, this is Mrs. Dorothy Jenkins, 74 years old, resident of Plano, Texas. The chairman administered the oath. Mrs. Jenkins raised a trembling, liver-spotted right hand. I do, she whispered, her voice barely carrying until the clerk adjusted her microphone. Homan turned his attention to the large electronic screens above the dais. Clerk, bring up Exhibit 2A. Cross-reference FEC batch file 884 against the Act Blue transaction log for the Northern District of Texas. The screens flashed. Rows upon rows of digital records populated the monitors in tight, glowing spreadsheets. Mrs. Jenkins, Homan began gently, his gravelly tone softening with deliberate respect. I want you to look at the screen in front of you. Do you recognize the name, the home address, and the last four digits of the Social Security number listed under donor ID 4092? The elderly woman put on a pair of reading glasses, squinting at the monitor. Yes, sir, that's my name. That's the little house on 14th Street where I've lived since my husband passed. Thank you, ma'am, Homan said. He turned back toward Crockett, whose arms remained crossed, though her eyes were now fixed sharply on the glowing ledger. Mrs. Jenkins, according to the official filing submitted to the Federal Election Commission through the Democratic Processing Platform Act Blue between January of last year and June of this year, your profile executed exactly 2,741 separate financial donations. A faint gasp rippled through the press gallery. These transactions, Homan continued, his voice deliberate, occurred at all hours of the night, $3.50 at 2:14 a.m., $12.20 at 3:45 a.m., $27 at 4:10 a.m. Over 18 months, your identity was used to process $48,620 in political contributions. And dozens of those microtransactions went directly into the campaign account of Jasmine for U.S. Homan paused, letting the numbers settle over the silent room. Mrs. Jenkins, did you authorize $48,000 in political donations? No, sir, Dorothy Jenkins answered, her voice cracking with raw emotion. She gripped the edge of the witness table, her knuckles whitening. I don't have $48,000. I live on a fixed Social Security check of $900 a month. Half of that goes to my rent, the other half goes to my heart medication and groceries. Some months I have to skip pills just to keep the lights on. A reporter in the front row stopped typing, staring up at the frail witness. Mrs. Jenkins, Homan asked, do you own a personal computer, a smartphone, or an online payment account? No, sir. I have an old flip phone my son bought me for emergencies, she testified, wiping a tear from her cheek. I don't know how to send money on the internet, and I have never heard of Congresswoman Crockett until federal investigators knocked on my front door with these papers. I didn't give that money. Somebody stole my name. Across the dais, Jasmine Crockett's posture shifted. Her hands dropped from her chest to the desk. She grabbed a yellow legal pad, rapidly scribbling a note to her chief of staff, who was already furiously tapping on a phone screen behind her. Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins, Homan said. He signaled to the right side of the witness table where Marcus Vance, a senior forensic financial investigator, adjusted his microphone. Mr. Vance, Homan directed, explain to the committee exactly what the American public is looking at on Exhibit 2B. Marcus Vance tapped his keyboard, bringing up a complex flowchart mapping digital payment routes. What we are seeing here is an automated laundering structure commonly known in financial forensics as a smurfing scheme. Vance testified in clear clinical language. Under federal law, specifically Title 52, United States Code, Section 30122, it is a federal crime to make a political contribution in the name of another person. It is also well known that donations under $200 do not require mandatory public employer itemization under standard FEC reporting thresholds. Vance pointed his laser at the center of the diagram. Our data audit traced the IP addresses executing these transactions. They did not originate from Mrs. Jenkins' flip phone in Plano. They originated from automated server farms, routing funds diverted from nonprofit migrant relief networks. These automated bots took massive pools of unvetted capital, chopped them into thousands of micro donations between $3 and $30, and slapped the stolen identities of senior citizens, retirees, and low-income Texans onto each transaction. It is a systematic mechanism designed to circumvent federal contribution limits and wash dark money directly into designated campaign accounts. The room remained dead silent. The evidence was technical, precise, and completely stripped of political theater. Tom Homan closed the folder in front of him. He looked up from the table, locking his gaze squarely on Jasmine Crockett. You sat there moments ago, Congresswoman, and you lectured this committee about representing the working people of Texas, Homan said, his voice cutting through the room with devastating clarity. You boasted about $5 and $10 checks from honest citizens. But here sits Mrs. Dorothy Jenkins. She is an honest citizen of Texas. She worked 40 years of her life, paid her taxes, and now survives on $900 a month. Homan leaned forward, both hands planted on the witness desk. Your political machine didn't represent Mrs. Jenkins, it preyed on her. It took her identity, stripped her name of its privacy, and turned a vulnerable widow into a fake donor to launder cash into your campaign coffers. That isn't grassroots democracy, Congresswoman. That is cold, calculated exploitation. And no amount of speeches about moral superiority can change what the data proves. The sudden pivot was as predictable as a Washington budget deficit. When caught with their hands deep in the cookie jar of ActBlue microtransactions, modern lawmakers rarely apologize. Instead, they immediately summon an existential humanitarian crisis to change the subject. Jasmine Crockett snatched her microphone, adjusting her posture to recapture the moral high ground before the cameras could linger on the bank records. This committee is engaging in cheap parlor tricks to distract from a humanitarian catastrophe. By dismantling temporary protected status, the administration is actively signing the death warrants of millions of vulnerable souls from Haiti, Somalia, and Ethiopia. We are talking about human lives, mister. Homan families fleeing bloodshed, war, and famine, and you want to lecture us about campaign accounting? Beside her, Ilhan Omar seized the lifeline, nodding vigorously toward the press gallery. Exactly. Terminating TPS is nothing short of a cruel, xenophobic death sentence. Tom Homan adjusted his cuffs, entirely unbothered by the sudden shift in terrain. Congresswoman Crockett, since you wish to change the subject from campaign finance to federal statutory definitions, allow me to offer a brief lesson in basic English grammar and constitutional law. The word is temporary protected status. In our legal lexicon, temporary means temporary. It does not mean an unlegislated backdoor path to permanent residency that stretches for 2 decades while Congress looks the other way. Homan leaned into the microphone, his cadence crisp and deliberate. You claim terminating TPS is illegal and cruel. Federal Judge Brian Murphy apparently disagrees with you. Just days ago, Judge Murphy dissolved the judicial stay, allowing the termination of TPS for Ethiopia to proceed. That single legal victory dismantled the last judicial roadblock, putting terminations into full effect across 12 designated nations from Haiti, Syria, and Yemen to Afghanistan, Cameroon, Nepal, Honduras, Nicaragua, South Sudan, Burma, Somalia, and El Salvador. That is more than 1 million individuals whose temporary stay has formally expired under the letter of the law. Homan glanced at his notes, pausing to let the weight of the numbers register with the press corps. Let's look at the sheer mathematics of what progressive open border policies have engineered, Homan continued, gesturing toward the monitors. There are currently 330,000 Haitians residing under these expired shields. There are 500,000 Venezuelans. To put that into perspective for the American taxpayer, there are entire sovereign states in our union with populations smaller than the demographic block of non-citizens you have imported and shielded from federal enforcement. When you drop 500,000 unvetted individuals into American communities, you do not simply manage a humanitarian caseload, you fundamentally alter the economic infrastructure, the housing market, the municipal budgets, and the political representation of this nation. Crockett scoffed openly, leaning toward her microphone. Those people were fleeing violence. You speak of them as if they are invading numbers on a spreadsheet rather than human beings wearing ankle monitors under your regime of surveillance. I am glad you brought up the ankle monitors, Congresswoman, Homan responded smoothly. He turned to his left. The chair recognizes Sheriff Dan Miller of Val Verde County, Texas. The veteran border sheriff reached beneath the table, pulled a heavy evidence bag from his leather briefcase and turned it over. Clatter. 3 thick industrial-grade electronic ankle monitors hit the wooden surface of the witness table, their rubber straps jaggedly sliced and the plastic casings caked with dried Rio Grande mud. Sheriff Miller adjusted his lapel mic, his weathered face hard as flint. Congresswoman Crockett, the media narrative claims these migrants were given no choice. The documented truth on the southern border tells a very different story. Every single Haitian national referenced in these files was offered a dignified, fully funded voluntary departure package. They were offered $2,000 in direct cash assistance to return home safely to Port-au-Prince and rebuild their lives. But your NGO partners, funded by federal grants, dispatched activists to the holding facilities with specific coaching, refuse the cash, demand the ankle monitor, then cut the strap the moment you step off the bus in Houston, Dallas, or Chicago. Miller tapped his index finger against the severed plastic casings. These 3 monitors were cut off behind a strip mall in my county by individuals with violent felony warrants who subsequently vanished into the sanctuary corridors your office champions. That isn't refugee protection, Congresswoman. That is organized lawlessness. Before Crockett could formulate a procedural rebuttal, Homan pressed an audio control switch on the console before him. And while we examine the collapse of domestic rule of law, let us address the root question of allegiance, Homan stated, his gaze locking directly onto Ilhan Omar, because while American citizens struggle with double-digit grocery inflation, soaring rents, and violent crime spilling across Minneapolis and Chicago, some members of this body appear to be operating as foreign emissaries. The room speakers crackled to life. A crisp, high-definition recording played across the chamber. It was Ilhan Omar's voice, speaking in Somali during a gathering in Minneapolis, accompanied on the video screen by a certified Department of State English translation transcript. The U.S. government will do what we want and nothing else. They must follow our orders. As long as I am in the U.S. Congress, no one will take Somalia's sea. The United States will not support other countries seeking to rob Somalia. The audio cut off. Omar's knuckles turned white around her pen. You took an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States, Congresswoman Omar, Homan said, each word landing with surgical precision. You did not swear an oath to safeguard the territorial waters of Mogadishu. You sit on federal committees demanding infinite USAID dollar pipelines to regions with birth rates 4 times higher than our own, while working-class neighborhoods in your own congressional district decay under rising homicide rates and bankrupt municipal services. Why is it that the American taxpayer is expected to subsidize the entire globe while their elected representatives prioritize foreign coastal jurisdictions over their own constituents? Omar leaned forward, her voice rising in pitch as she attempted to regain control of the narrative. That recording is an intentionally mistranslated, malicious distortion taken completely out of context to question my patriotism. The translation was verified by 3 independent federal linguistic analysts under penalty of perjury, Homan replied without blinking. The words belong to you. And unfortunately for your coalition, the era where hollow accusations of racism could shield blatant foreign favoritism and systemic domestic corruption has officially reached its expiration date. Across the dais, the progressive line of defense was visibly fracturing, setting the stage for the administrative machinery that was already grinding into motion behind closed doors. Mr. Chairman, point of order, point of order. Jasmine Crockett's voice slammed through the committee chamber like a freight train, her manicured fingers stabbing repeatedly into the air toward the presiding gavel. This hearing has devolved into an unhinged defamatory circus orchestrated to dismantle the constitutional separation of powers. If the witness refuses to respect congressional oversight, we will move immediately for an emergency recess, file procedural sanctions, and march these unconstitutional executive overreaches straight to the steps of the United States Supreme Court. Next to her, Ilhan Omar frantically signaled to the ranking member, her voice rising above the gallery chatter. We are witnessing the weaponization of the federal apparatus against sovereign communities. We will take this to the highest court in the land, and we will shut down this legislative sabotage. Tom Homan did not flinch. He did not seek the chairman's protection. Instead, he stood up. The sheer physical presence of the former border director commanded the room. Standing tall behind the witness desk, he adjusted the lapels of his suit jacket and drew a crisp single-page memorandum from his inner coat pocket. You threatened to march to the Supreme Court, Congresswoman Crockett. Homan spoke into the microphone, his voice resonance carrying across the room without straining. Allow me to spare you the cab fare. As of 0800 hours this morning, James Pearl, General Counsel for the Department of Homeland Security, officially confirmed the legal reality. Every judicial stay has collapsed, every procedural roadblock has dissolved, and all temporary protected status terminations are now in immediate, unappealable effect across the United States of America. He held the signed DHS document in the air, letting the gallery cameras zoom in on the official federal seal. For 2 decades, progressive administrations treated the word temporary as a linguistic suggestion, a perpetual blank check written on the backs of American taxpayers. That era is over. But terminating the TPS pipeline is merely the baseline. Let us discuss what is actually happening on the sovereign soil of this republic. Homan leaned forward, bracing both hands against the edge of the mahogany table, addressing the entire committee dais with unyielding command. Under a historic joint directive from the Department of Justice, the federal government has officially designated half of the southern border as an active restricted military installation. That means the United States Armed Forces are no longer standing by as passive spectators taking notes on clipboards. They are enforcing federal military law. Any individual attempting to cross that boundary outside of a designated port of entry is no longer committing a civil administrative misdemeanor. They are committing the federal offense of trespassing on a United States military base, subject to immediate apprehension, detention, and military tribunal jurisdiction. Omar's jaw tightened. Crockett sat frozen, her hand hovering inches above her unmuted microphone. And for the great state of Texas, Homan continued, gesturing firmly toward the Texas delegation. The constitutional handcuffs have been removed. The Department of Justice has formally acknowledged the inherent sovereign right of Texas law enforcement to arrest, prosecute, and directly deport criminal non-citizens off American soil, bypassing every layer of progressive municipal obstruction. Homan signaled to the clerk. Bring up the Department of Homeland Security Executive Directive 4A. The massive monitors flashed to life, displaying a cascade of federal policy overhauls that sent an electric jolt through the press gallery. Let us examine the total realignment of our immigration infrastructure, Homan declared, enumerating each provision with devastating rhythmic clarity. The diversity visa lottery, a broken system that handed out American citizenship like raffle tickets at a county fair, has been indefinitely paused. The H-1B tech lottery has been dismantled. Severe, unyielding bureaucratic vetting hurdles have been locked onto H-1B, F-1J-1, and OPT student programs, ending the corporate cheap labor pipeline. All visa processing has been frozen across 75 non-compliant nations. Strict travel bans have been enacted against 39 state sponsors of regional instability. Lawful entries have plummeted by 99%. Naturalization denials have doubled. Green card issuances have been severed in half, and interior asylum denials have reached an all-time record high. The United States Refugee Admissions Program has been suspended nationwide. The single exception under active refugee review is the demographic of farmers from South Africa facing verified systemic persecution and violence on their ancestral lands. Homan tapped his finger on the final slide. A towering vertical green bar chart. And look at this metric right here. Homan said, his voice ringing with absolute conviction. Voluntary departures from the United States have increased by 2,800%, 28 times. When you dismantle the welfare slush funds, when you freeze the illicit NGO debit cards, and when you demonstrate that the law will be executed without compromise, the incentive structure collapses. People pack their bags and return to their homelands voluntarily because they understand the free ride is permanently closed. Homan turned his gaze directly toward Omar and Crockett, delivering a masterclass in American populist governance. The media and the globalist lobby love endless foreign distractions. They want this country to spend its wealth acting as the toll keeper of the Strait of Hormuz or subsidizing regions with birth rates 4 times higher than our own, while working-class Americans can't afford a gallon of milk or a tank of regular unleaded. The American electorate did not vote to be the dumping ground for the Third World. They voted for cheap gas, cheap groceries, affordable homes, and safe streets for American citizens. That is how a nation survives. That is how we win. Crockett's face flushed with fury. She grabbed her microphone, shouting over the murmurs of the room, "You think this is over? You think an executive fiat can silence the millions of activists who will take to the streets from Dallas to Minneapolis? We will mobilize every progressive organization in this country. We will grind your logistics to a halt, and we will file an emergency injunction before the Supreme Court, before the sun sets today." Tom Homan checked the silver watch on his left wrist. A faint, knowing smile crossed his face. "Congresswoman Crockett, Congresswoman Omar, you won't need to trouble the Supreme Court today," Homan said calmly into the mic, "because as we speak, the wheels of justice are already in motion." Suddenly, a cacophony of electronic chimes, buzzes, and alert tones erupted throughout the press gallery. Dozens of journalists snatched their smartphones simultaneously. Laptops clicked frantically. Above the dais, the giant cable news feed on the wall monitor abruptly cut its scheduled programming, flashing the blood-red graphic. Breaking news. The live television feed displayed an aerial shot of K Street in Washington, D.C., where a fleet of black federal law enforcement SUVs with flashing emergency lights was parked outside the glass-fronted headquarters of E Street Group, the consulting firm owned by Tim Minette. On screen, armed FBI tactical agents and Department of Justice forensic auditors were seen wheeling industrial-sized evidence, crates, hard drives, and boxed financial ledgers out of the building under federal search warrants. A split screen opened up simultaneously over Dallas, Texas. Uniformed federal marshals and IRS criminal investigation agents were shown barricading the regional headquarters of 3 major NGO entities linked to the Act Blue micro-donation processing network, seizing primary server racks and transaction logs under armed guard. Inside the Rayburn hearing room, the silence was absolute. Jasmine Crockett stared at the video monitors, her mouth slightly agape, the fiery defiance completely evaporating from her posture. The red recording light on her desk microphone continued to glow, but not a single sound came out. Ilhan Omar dropped her gold pin. Her hand shook visibly as she shoved scattered papers, folders, and briefing binders into her leather tote bag, her eyes darting toward the exits as her chief legal counsel leaned over, whispering frantically in her ear with a look of pale, unvarnished dread. Tom Homan stood straight, his eyes scanning the 2 shaken lawmakers before delivering his closing words to the committee. "Rhetoric on social media can manufacture temporary fame. Staged outrage can purchase a handful of fleeting votes. But enduring reality is built on verifiable balance sheets, empirical evidence, and the unyielding majesty of constitutional law. When you turn the sovereign wealth of the American taxpayer into a private laundering apparatus for family balance sheets and political cartels, your own words become the exact instrument of your undoing. The United States of America is not a dumping ground for globalist ambition, and it will never again serve as a private cash register for those who betray the public trust. Homan picked up his leather briefcase, turned to the chairman, and nodded. Bang! The gavel struck the sound block, bringing the historic hearing to an abrupt, definitive close. The fallout radiating from the Rayburn building permanently restructured the American political and institutional landscape. Criminal indictments and asset seizures. The Department of Justice formally impaneled a federal grand jury, unsealing comprehensive indictments under Title 52, United States Code, Section 30122 for aggregate straw donor fraud, identity theft, and grand money laundering. Federal judges immediately issued asset freeze orders on all domestic accounts affiliated with E Street Group, while the State Department placed international travel restrictions on Tim Minette and 17 top executive directors within the seized NGO syndicates. Congressional sanctions and historic expulsion inquiries. The House Ethics Committee convened an emergency executive session, passing a bipartisan resolution that formally stripped both Ilhan Omar and Jasmine Crockett of all standing committee assignments, including the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Committee on Oversight and Accountability. Simultaneously, formal petitions for House expulsion crossed the requisite signature threshold, setting up historic floor votes on their tenure in Congress. The systemic collapse of Act Blue's dark money apparatus. Attorneys general from 24 states launched coordinated multi-jurisdictional audits into Act Blue's back-end processing algorithms. Under intense regulatory pressure, federal financial regulators mandated mandatory two-factor identity verification requiring verified social security numbers and physical zip code confirmation for every political contribution under $200. Overnight, the volume of automated microdonations plummeted by 85%, suffocating the dark money conduits that had funded progressive activist infrastructure for over a decade. Border restoration and realignment of national priorities, with TPS completely dismantled and judicial interference eliminated, municipal encampments across major cities were systematically cleared. The joint operations between the Texas Department of Public Safety and the United States military swept through sanctuary transit corridors, apprehending hundreds of fugitives who had severed their electronic monitoring devices. As federal welfare pipelines dried up and legal loopholes snapped shut, voluntary repatriations broke all historic records. The national conversation pivoted definitively away from theoretical globalism and centered once more on domestic strength, affordable living for working families, and the sovereign rule of law.